So I'm Kristen Kalsum. I'm one of the co-directors for the Center for Race, Gender, and Social Justice here at the law school, and I want to take this time to welcome everyone and just to thank our colleagues in arts and sciences for asking us if we'd be interested in collaborating on a conference like this, because this is amazing. The presentations we've heard so far are so rich and thought-provoking, and that is just going to continue. So I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Cheryl Harris. And when we made this invitation, I asked her if she would mind coming just a little bit early so that she could give a talk or have coffee and conversation with my feminist legal theory class and Emily's critical race theory class, because we were like, we have her right here in Cincinnati. They're reading her work. It would be great if they would have a chance to meet with her. So I had 3 students who had conflicts since we weren't meeting at my class time, and one of them was cleared a long time ago, and it's on my syllabus. Be sure and clear this time. But a couple of students told me pretty late that they had not only a conflict, but that this professor had scheduled also a makeup class. So it was like a double conflict. It was a big class, not just a normal class. And I was like, oh, just the thought that they weren't going to be able to participate. So I sat down and wrote an email to this adjunct professor, and I'm trying to explain, and I'm like, and they have this opportunity to have this conversation with Cheryl Harris, and then in parentheses I'm like, she's a living legend in critical race feminism. And of course I was trying to be as persuasive as possible, and I was successful. But I realized when I was thinking about doing this introduction that really was not hyperbole on my part. When we were thinking about putting this conference together as to who would be someone who could stand up and give a keynote to this particular group of people, Cheryl immediately came to mind. She not only can talk about critical race theory and activism American style, but she also has done lots of work in the international arena. I think she's just an ideal person to tie some of our ideas together and, as always, give us new things to think about. So grabbing my glasses. Here's my official intro. Okay, so Cheryl is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Professor in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at UCLA. She teaches constitutional law, employment discrimination, civil rights, critical race theory, and race-conscious remedies. She's been recognized for her teaching excellence in many respects, but she specifically is the recipient of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California Distinguished Professor Award for Civil Rights Education. She is one of the founders and is currently the director of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA, which is the premier program of its kind. The mission of that program is to think new ideas, teach future leaders and scholars, and transform social justice advocacy, all of which we know they have been doing incredibly successfully since they started in the year 2000. The program has produced some of the leading lights in the field, some of whom have been quoted today. Those people have had the privilege of actually being mentored by Cheryl. Many of us have just been inspired by her and her scholarship. All of us, I'm sure, are familiar with whiteness as property, but Cheryl is able to bring a critical race lens to whatever happens to be happening in the current world, whether that was Hurricane Katrina a few years back, affirmative action, cases alleging reverse discrimination. Her scholarship gives us a way to look and see what's really happening in these cases. I could go on and on about all her writing and awards and honors, but I'd really much rather hear what she has to say to us here today, as I think is the case with all of you. At the class yesterday, when Cheryl was talking to my students, I just was reminded how generous she is with her time and her talents and her wisdom. Last night at dinner, I was reminded that she's an incredible lot of fun, as well as that she has real amazing life experiences and insights yet to share. So with that, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Cheryl Harris.
Thank you, Kristen, for such a generous introduction. I'm not quite sure how to work this. Let's see. I have a pretty big voice, though. Y'all can hear me? Thank you for inviting me. This has been a really important and interesting set of conversations. One of the things about trying to think about these questions transnationally is that they allow us to actually reflect on the domestic and our own circumstances with new eyes, and to find connections in places that we sometimes don't always anticipate. The title of my talk is called Transatlantic Roots, okay, Race and Resistance. I begin by thinking about poetry, which is one of my loves. And in 1999, the incomparable poet and activist Jane Cortez was one of the major conveners of a groundbreaking conference entitled Slave Roots, A Long Memory. Nearly 10 years later, in 2008, she convened a second conference entitled Slave Roots, Resistance, Abolition, and Creative Progress, which commemorated the 200-year anniversary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. In naming these historic gatherings Slave Roots, Cortez was calling for recognition of the centrality of slavery and unpacking and diagnosing the convoluted racial savagery of the present. Her use of roots in both instances deployed roots as in a course of direction, as a homophone, words that sound the same but have different meanings, the roots as in the course of direction for roots as in origin, to suggest that in mapping these roots and roots, the origins of oppression and resistance might be made visible. This is not to say that the relationship between roots and roots is uncontested. As a historian, Joseph Heathcote explains that Paul Gilroy worried a lot that excessive concentration on one could conceal the other. Thus, Heathcote notes that Gilroy cautioned, quote, "A focus on roots, the authentic origins of peoples and cultures, obscures the roots through which encounters unfold and identities shift, realign, and coalesce in time and space. African identities in the New World," Gilroy argued, for example, are recombinant, forged of necessity, emerging as soon as disparate people meet in the brutal hold of that most modern of institutions, the slaving ship. Heathcote reads Gilroy as, quote, "principally concerned with the formation of identities through the Middle Passage." But I understand Heathcote to make the case that the search for both roots and roots is critical. Quote, says Heathcote, "For Gilroy and for Stuart Hall and C.L.R. James before him, the local and the transnational are inextricably linked by regimes of production and consumption, as well as by systems of thought and meaning. Cultural forms may be grounded in local spaces of production and consumption, but the very material basis for that production, and indeed the ideologies that underpin meaning, often knit together people and processes across national boundaries." Cortez may not have been the first, and she certainly was not the only person to embrace the word-meaning relationship between roots and roots, but she was one of the most lucid and eloquent, suturing a poetic sensibility and aesthetic to hard, unadorned truth. While gifted in her use of imagery and sonic play, Cortez's poetry, her spoken word before there was spoken word, spat fire, and Fire Spitter being the title of one of her better-known collections and the name of her band. She spat fire in time to the unbounded rhythm of jazz, rendered an uncompromising indictment of colonialism and related systems of dispossession. In the trenchant signature poem, There It Is, Cortez points out that the nature of power is to mask itself, even as its effects are relentlessly manifest. As she put it, "The ruling class will tell you that there is no ruling class. As they organize their liberal supporters into white supremacist lynch mobs, organize their children into Ku Klux Klan gangs, organize their police into killer cops. This violence is in service of the accumulation of power and resources," she tells us. "A ruling class that will, quote, try to pump all the resources of the world into their own veins and fly off into the wild blue yonder to pollute another planet," unquote. As she chronicles the local effects, quote, "the bulldozers leaping into demolition dances, the old folks dying of starvation, the informers wearing out shoes looking for crumbs," she marks the global dimensions of its impact. Quote, the lifeblood of the earth almost dead in the greedy mouth of imperialism. And there it is. Thus she said, and if we don't fight, if we don't resist, if we don't organize and unify and get the power to control our own lives, then we will wear the exaggerated look of captivity. And there it is. In another one of her signature poems, U.S.-Nigeria Relations, the poem consists of one line, repeated with increasing velocity and volume. They want the oil, but they don't want the people. However, Cortez's intervention in the context of these two conferences, and in particular in the one in 1999, was to remind everyone that there was a time when they wanted the people too. That is, when the people were the commodities. This fact was a crucial element in the construction of a global market that was foundational to the creation of wealth and empire in both hemispheres, and the emergence of new forms of production, coerced labor, and dispossession. As Cortez put it in her keynote address, a lot of individuals supported our proposal for the conference, but a few said, why now? Why bring up this painful subject of slavery and the slave trade? Why now? And we said, why not now? Why not have a dialogue about the transatlantic slave trade and find out more about the political, social, and economic effects of the trade and the psychological impact of the encounter between cultures? Why not talk about the past and talk about the present relationship between Africa and its diaspora? Why not talk about the aftermath of the slave trade and the struggle against racism? Why not get a better understanding of the cultural contributions which exemplify aspects of survival and create change through modification of concepts, technology, and environment? Why not break the silence, break the fear, create solidarity and new links, and make the next 1,000 years the roof of freedom and peace, and make sure that no person on earth ever goes up to space in a slave ship? In thinking about the questions at the core of this gathering, the image of two polities, Europe and US at a crossroads, one marked by the aspiration to equality and democracy, the other by a racist, regressive populism, I was drawn to Cortez's call to think about the transatlantic trade 2 decades ago in both its prescience and its urgency. So I want to begin where Cortez does by investigating the roots, the origins and geographies of race and oppression. I initiate this journey from my intellectual home, critical race theory, and by doing so, however, I am less invested in finding parallels or analogs to basic precepts of critical race theory abroad, and am more interested in investing in critical race theory as methodology. This is not because I view the foundational ideas associated with CRT as less relevant to the current moment or task. Rather, it's because I want to highlight that these foundational ideas emerged like intersectionality, for example, or interest convergence, were not the product of an organizational manifesto. They came out of a collective critical analysis of specific conditions that attended the end of the so-called Second Reconstruction. It was a specific application of what Cornel West long ago called a genealogical historical analysis. Critical race theory turns its attention to the conditions, the material and ideological realities of the late 20th century, in which law reform projects such as the Voting Rights Act and others, and the basic infrastructure of modern-day anti-discrimination law, won through popular organizing and struggle, were under assault by an invigorated right, both in ordinary politics and in the courts. That assault was only weakly resisted by a liberal to liberal centrist coalition that was committed to sustaining the legislative products of the movement, but was internally conflicted over whether a focus on race was necessary or even strategically advisable in doing so. I won't rehearse here the founding of CRT, as other writers have done far better, including Sumi Cho and others than I have. Rather, I'll suggest that the insights associated with critical race theory grew out of a method that specifically self-identified as an anti-subordination project and sought to critically engage the dominant narrative about the relationship between race and law. In the post-Brown dispensation, liberalism's account of race and law, that race was a neutral arbiter of disputes that was at times polluted by or infected by racial dynamics, differed from conservative accounts in terms of the ongoing salience of race and consequently the normative force of demands to address inequality. But curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, Both assumed that law and legal institutions best functioned when race was not part of the calculus. In this respect, both liberal and conservative views of law cohered in taking colorblindness as a normative given. Liberals quarreled with conservatives over the role of racism in ongoing patterns of racial inequality, and further disputed whether that racial inequality could be addressed only through colorblind means. However, neither of these views took into account that law itself is the site of the construction of racial power. This means law is not simply a neutral field that reflects the dynamics and contestations around race that are out there somewhere. It's a location in which race itself is being made, not only through the doctrines of anti-discrimination law, but across the entire field of law. This idea of race and law is mutually constitutive, that law makes race and race makes law, remains true. However, how this plays out is locally specific and highly variable, given different systems of law, cultures, and social organization. But I think it remains an important jumping off point as a corrective lens to the tendency to conceive of law as merely reflective of broader social patterns. So in taking up the question that our organizers here have posed about transatlantic approaches to equality, I think they have accurately located us on both sides of the Atlantic as caught between, quote, oppositional poles of equal citizenship and democratic self-rule on the one hand, and reaction in the form of xenophobia, nationalism, and populism on the other. These are important terms of contestation, but there are other terms equally essential that I want to put on the table today, inspired by Cortez: dispossession, colonialism, racial subordination, and white supremacy. And thank you, Emily, for bringing that word into the room earlier. These are also transnational phenomena whose origins lie in slavery and the expropriation of land and labor. And these are global systems which manifest with particularities and contradictions in different contexts. But I think it's important to trace these roots as a way of thinking about a kind of common grounding for where one might think about these interventions. And so the first part of the paper is really a kind of transatlantic history of property and race and white supremacy. And the second part is really a reflection more on the current moment. So here goes. The transatlantic slave trade and the system of enslavement was central to the development of the American nation and to Europe. I think, this is a truism, but it completely escapes both domestic politics in this country, and I gather to say racial discourses in Europe as well. In this way, race and racial oppression were central to the growth and development of capitalism. While slavery was a practice that became closely integrated into the British colonies, as political theorist Cedric Robinson points out, the antecedent to the American colonial project was the evolution of racial capitalism in Europe. So even before we talk about colonization in the New World, he argues that the substrate for racial capitalism was already laid in Europe. Capitalism in Europe, he argues, grew out of a racialized society in which groups like the Irish, Slavs, and others were subjected to a colonial process and expropriation justified through a racial logic. This logic did not then depend on phenotype. The phenotype is a later addition, right? Racialist myths about inferior peoples were prominent and provided a template for how Africans later were converted into an enslavable and inferior racial caste. Britain was not alone in this project. Spanish colonial settlements in the Americas had attempted to solve the labor shortage in the colonies by conscripting convicts and foreign immigrants. But by the mid-16th century, the Spanish turned to exploit Indian labor. And as Andres Resendez documents, the Spanish enslavement of Indians initiated the forms of New World enslavement that followed, and the evolution of capitalist exploitation of labor and land dispossession. Colonial enslavement produced catastrophic genocidal effects on the indigenous population, and as it became increasingly evident that the enslavement of indigenous peoples would not meet the labor demand, increasing numbers of white indentured servants bound to serve for a term of years were shipped to the colonies from Europe, along with convicts and those regarded as trash. As Eric Williams put it in his classic Colonialism and Slavery, quote, this immigration was in tune with the mercantilist theories of the day, which strongly advocated putting the poor to industrious and useful labor and favored immigration, voluntary and involuntary, as relieving the poor rates and finding more profitable occupations for idlers and vagrants at home. The founding of the settlement at Jamestown in 1609 was followed shortly after by the arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619. They joined free blacks, indentured servants, and others as part of a multiracial bonded labor population. And while initially the British colonies were small, embattled, and economically marginal entities, the growth and development of an export commodity market, initially tobacco, increased profits, and over time, this commerce increased the demand for labor. So, of course, the question of the growth of slavery in North America has been debated by historians for decades. We don't have that long enough to review all of that. That's like a library of literature, right? But I want to just take a sort of pass at a couple of the thematics which I want to bring out for today. So the question is, classically put, is did slavery in the North American colonies take root in the 17th century as an outgrowth of racism, or was it a consequence of economic necessity? Eric Williams, again, contends that the preference for black labor was motivated by economic concerns, as it was cheaper than other forms, and so as he put it, quote, slavery was not born of racism, racism was a consequence of slavery. Edward Morgan, however, has asserted that there are elements of both prejudice and profit that explain what happens. Other scholars have contended that racism, in the sense of marking other groups as inferior, actually predated capitalism. However, I want to focus in on Theodore Allen, whose really seminal book, Invention of the White Race, has been a big inspiration in my thinking on this project. He points out that, quote, the white race was invented after the arrival of the first Africans in the North American colonies. He asserts that, quote, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people here, nor, according to the colonial records, would there be for another 60 years. The colonists initially identified as English, and the word white did not appear until the late 1600s. This is not to say that there were not racialist ideas that accompanied the colonization of the New World. The point, rather, is that the hardening of whiteness, what Theodore Allen calls the invention of the white race, was the product of historically contingent processes, and it was invented as a ruling class social control formation. He contends that the ruling class created a system of racial privileges that would ensure that a buffer class would be disincentivized from any form of labor solidarity with the enslaved, as manifested in earlier rebellions, particularly Bacon's rebellion, which he thinks is really key in this story. Allen argues that this poor, propertyless class of European Americans, quote, were promoted to the white race and endowed with unprecedented civil and social privileges vis-a-vis African Americans, privileges that were made to be conditional on keeping non-whites down and out. He contends that this was not simply disastrous for blacks. There were negative, albeit very different consequences for European American workers as well. Although their class interests were fundamentally distinct from the white working class, they constituted a buffer whose position and whose social status came to rest on their race rather than their property. Another way that I'm thinking about this is the foundation of the white coalition. This sort of explains how whiteness functions as a coalitional, all racial identities function as a coalition, but how whiteness comes to pass or comes to exist as a cross-class coalition. At the same time, not all in this buffer class remained propertyless. Some became pioneers, settling more territory and constituting the front line in pushing the western frontier. The process of claiming indigenous land was not simply the concern of elites and major landowners, and this was the American innovation. It was every man's opportunity. As Kay-Sue Park, our critical race studies fellow at UCLA, a brilliant scholar in her own right, as she explains, settlement was a process of indigenous removal. It was facilitated by the spread of disease for which Indians lacked immunity, decimating the population, and the ecological transformation that settlement worked on the environment, making game and other resources scarce. It was also reflected in the willingness to engage in violent conflict to secure what they viewed as their interest and their right. Through various policies, colonial authorities offered a number of incentives to settlers, including land grants and head grants, conveying acres to heads of household and land for each household member. And this new class of landowners began farms of their own. For their part, the established growers began in about 1660 to rely more heavily on enslaved blacks for their labor needs. Slaves were more expensive initially, but their terms did not end. Blacks brought to the North American colony, both as slaves and servants, generally worked, ate, and slept with white servants. But the presence of enslaved Africans sharpened incentives to mark distinctions between those who were enslavable, distinctions that became to be racially defined. And then I talk a bit about the slave codes and the black and how they played this important role. In Britain, in 1688, so I'm sort of telling this story on both sides of the Atlantic at the same time. In Britain, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution also marked an important event with respect to slavery in the colonies. As Gerald Horne explains, in part, this conflict had its origins in tensions between the monarchy and an emergent merchant class, which sought to expand its role in the slave trade and push the monarchy into some concessions. So the irony here is that it's pushing against sort of feudal arrangements for the purposes of being allowed to participate more fully in the trade. The ensuing rush into the trade greatly increased economic growth in the colonies, as well as, and this is crucial, more intense resistance and revolt by enslaved Africans. Enslaved Africans across the Americas were engaged in rebellions, from the more spectacular uprisings to everyday acts of resistance. These revolts produced great anxiety in Britain and fears that the entire Caribbean colonial enterprise was at risk of collapse because of increasing cost and difficulty in protecting the slave system. At the same time, we have the emergence of an abolitionist movement in England that ensured that these arguments gained traction. So you have this dual nature of both resistance, abolition, and this fear of revolt that actually entrenches racist ideology in response. Back on the other side of the Atlantic, this fear of resistance tended to lessen the economic and political differences between rich and poor whites. The rich began to look to their less wealthy neighbors for political support against the English government and in local elections. Wealthy whites retained all their former prerogatives, but the creation of a black subclass enabled poor whites to identify with and support the policies of the upper class. With the safe economic advantage provided by their slaves, large landowners were willing to grant poor whites a larger role in the political process. Thus, paradoxically, slavery for blacks led to greater freedom for poor whites. And in this way, white male Protestants exercised liberties beyond those possible in much of the empire, but these freedoms were intimately tied to the subordination of racial others and the exclusion of women of a particular class from the public sphere. As Aziz Rana notes, quote, rather than separate currents flowing into the well of American values, the democratic ideals themselves gained strength and meeting through frameworks of exclusion. This birth of the nation was articulated through a language of liberty that was built on a foundation of unfreedom. And this settler colonial society conceived of itself in opposition to the old European order as anti-imperial in character. The relentless dispossession of indigenous people was central to the project, but the Constitution served to legitimate the white republic as a democratic experiment. Rana explains that with the closure of the frontier that happens sort of in the mid-1800s and the completion of the expansion of North America, a different articulation and justification for the national power was required. And so you have the growth of the American empire, the acquisition of the Philippines, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and others, not just justified as a project to secure goods and values as it had been under old Europe, but, quote, spreading mutually advantageous commercial trade, democracy, and peace. American exceptionalism thus reconfigured colonial domination as a project of uplift for those people whose lands that it conquered or took over. As Rana describes, in this period, we see the, quote, move from the white republic to a new version of progress, democratic uplift, and markets. And it's this markets part that I think is crucial here. So in the second part here, what is the relationship of the present to the past? How are racial structures and hegemony updated and maintained? How does one calculate or assess the role of race or white supremacy in an era of neoliberalism, particularly given the shift towards the politics of white nationalism? The objective of neoliberal reforms, if we begin here to think about sort of the political economy of where we are, is to both limit government investment and expenditures, and as David Harvey explains, to, quote, bring all human action into the domain of the market. Where there is no market, markets are to be established, even and especially for social welfare infrastructure, so education, water, healthcare, all goods traditionally provided by the state are to be delivered through the market. To achieve this goal, then the hallmark of neoliberal governments is deregulation, privatization, and reductions in public expenditures, as well as the transfer of control over goods and services to the private sphere. It is also heavily reliant on debt as a way of structuring social, political, and economic relations. Neoliberalism, however, is more than a phenomenon that merely coexists with or deploys the racial logic of white supremacy. In important ways, neoliberalism's deification of the market, it is a religion after all, is related to capitalist structures which rely upon and undergird racial domination and hierarchy. Current market regimes structure race and property and carry forward patterns of racial subjugation established through enslavement and dispossession in earlier periods. Slavery as a system of labor and property treated enslaved bodies as living currency, around which were built valuation systems, insurance, financial products, and institutions central to and essential to the modern nature of racial capitalism. It was and is, to some extent still, a system of global trade, finance, and commodification that sutured the value of lives and bodies to race. The posting of enslaved Africans as collateral allowed for increased lending through mortgages, which were funded through the sale of bonds in the global market, not just the domestic market. These bonds that were backed by human collateral securitized black bodies, and investors in free territories in Europe profited. Slavery's formal abolition did not erase these financial networks. Instead, in slavery's afterlife, they were reestablished through colorblind but racially targeted mechanisms, including particularly the creation and management of debt. One could argue that under neoliberalism, debt is the most highly valued commodity. Individual, that is private debt, community debt, cities, municipal corporations, and entities, and the debt of nations is a commodity, even an asset, at the heart of much economic activity, negotiation, exchange of value, and through state practices of regulation and deregulation, debt is created and managed. At every level, the racial legacies of slavery and the trade are intricately interwoven and reproduced. Racial hierarchy is continually replenished through the market, which encodes property with value that is indexed to a racial regime while simultaneously obscuring the racial dispossession of land and people at its core. Thus, for example, in slavery's afterlife, debt is a critical mechanism functioning as a crucial strategy of accumulation through what the late Clyde Woods describes as asset stripping from the local level to the international level. The focus after the murder of Michael Brown identified the role of debt in the criminal sanctions system. Thank you, Anna, for bringing Michael Brown's murder to us in this moment. The use of policing to cite minor municipal offenses, impose fines and fees as a mean of revenue extraction from its black population. Brown's murder by the police caused a kind of interrogation of what the underlying practices were and exposed the contemporary forms of debtor prisons, which are ostensibly illegal, but nevertheless quite ubiquitous. The imposition of criminal justice debt is both simultaneously a system of value extraction and racial control. This does not mean that economic predations that I'm describing are visited solely on blacks, but rather that its forms, logics, and justification are deeply racialized, even as they are articulated in seemingly race-neutral terms. Beyond criminal justice debt, unemployment and underemployment ensure instability in the labor market so that the constant conditions of precarity push disproportionate numbers of black people into quote-unquote subprime status, even as the estimates are that more than half of the consumers in the United States are subprime. So if you're subprime, just raise your hand. Subprime status, however, is favored by Wall Street and the global financial markets generally. So while one might think that risky borrowers would not garner approval in the financial markets, in fact, they are much desired because the securitization of that debt pays such high returns that big profits still remain even after the defaults and the bankruptcies are subtracted. So the securitization of this debt is very attractive because of its high yield. It's high risk, it's high yield. They want it. As Xenia Kish and Justin Leroy in their article Bonded Life argue, Financialization has been and continues to be a deeply racialized process, transforming subjects considered valueless into appropriate, even laudable objects of financial investment. The subprime mortgage crisis that precipitated the Great Depression of 2008 did not cure this addiction. The features of subprime mortgage market now have been transferred to commercial credit or consumer credit, auto loans, credit lending. Auto loans are really attractive, by the way, because they're backed by collateral. They're not like other sort of unsecured loans. And so you have these onerous terms, these hidden dealer markups, these yield spread premiums, all of which is about a racially discriminatory assessment of risk. Race is a feature of the subprime. Denise Ferreira da Silva and Paula Chakrabarty argued persuasively in American Quarterly several years ago that under the racial logic of global capitalism, quote, racial and cultural difference as an element of representation enters into risk calculations. The term subprime mortgage has become, they argue, a racial signifier in the current debate about the causes and fixes for capitalism in crisis. Shifting from the individual to the collective, we can also see how debt plays out at the level of the community. The fact that Ferguson and other municipalities have adopted this form of revenue extraction through criminal justice debt is not simply a consequence of the economic downturn. Studies reflect that the places that are most likely to adopt this model have higher percentages of black residents. And I should also say parenthetically, to complicate the picture further, a lot of these places, particularly in the northern county where Ferguson is located, are under black governmental leadership. So, just in point, right? Moreover, there is a racialized structure that undergirds the financial architecture of cities like Ferguson, as Walter Johnson mapped recently. While the focus on the use of the criminal sanction system as a means of racialized revenue extraction is important, he points out that this form of predation lays alongside structural patterns of racial segregation that created multiple municipalities as a way of securing racial boundaries and borders and protecting whites from blacks. The restriction of taxing authority of those municipalities to sales tax and other regressive forms of revenue was important. At the same time, the state precluded the raising of property taxes by these local authorities, which would have allowed for the incorporation of Ferguson's Fortune 500 company, there is one in Ferguson, into the basic tax base, which might have then not necessitated the shortfalls that called for these use of the criminal justice system to extract money. The company was severely underassessed pursuant to development incentives that abated taxes on corporations for decades, as well as other municipal financing mechanisms that raised money through bond instruments that were backstopped ultimately by residents should the anticipated increase in income from the development not materialize. Black spaces and geographies that house black people are often deemed to be wasteland, but the fact that they are constructed as waste, as throwaway, means that they are deeply in debt, subprime, and valuable. They are available for further asset stripping in the sense that they are not sort of protected by the usual forms of political voice, etc. And they are, in fact, there's a reason, for example, why payday loans are all in poor neighborhoods. Through the mechanism of the permanent emergency built around the debt crisis, these crises are often, though the mechanism of permanent emergency is often built around debt crises, these crises are often structurally engendered. This sets up black geographies as spaces that require extra scrutiny and oversight, a kind of financial racial profiling. Flint and Detroit remain the most visible examples of this phenomenon. Both of these are predominantly black and among some of the most poverty-stricken cities in the United States, and both have been placed under forms of external management. In Flint, under the state's emergency management law that was passed by the legislature after it was rejected by the electorate. Right. So voters in the state of Michigan said, no, we don't want this law, and the Republican legislature said, nevertheless, you're going to have it. And in Detroit, its school system was placed under an emergency manager that turned out to be the same emergency manager that made the decision regarding the water in Flint. So after he got through screwing up the school system in Detroit, they sent him to Flint, and now we know the rest in terms of the water. The legal infrastructure that allowed for this takeover takes debt as the predicate for removing structures of democratic control and makes, under the statute, the payment of the debt in full as the primary task of the emergency manager. So imagine now a system where you have a locality that's in some kind of financial stress. What is the solution? You put them under emergency management system, you take away all the systems of democratic control, and by statute you say that the emergency manager's first and primary task is to pay the debt in full. Right? Forget the so-called taking a haircut, forget any negotiation. Your job is to just, whatever the bonds say, whatever the face value says, pay it in full. While the prevailing picture is that the indebtedness of these locations is either an inevitability or the result of mismanagement or both, in addition to the kinds of corporate financial incentives that Johnson identified, one of the reasons the cities are in such trouble has to do with the shrinking amount of revenue sharing that the state now provides. According to a report by the Municipal League, when Detroit filed for bankruptcy several years ago, between 2003 and 2013, it had missed out on over $730 million that had originally due it by the state. So the state itself, meaning that is the state of Michigan, not sort of the generic state, is causing the financial emergencies that are invoked as the reason for intervention. And there is a very clear racial pattern of the exercise of emergency authority. So even though the emergency authority statute says nothing about race, it turns out the places where this has been exercised are black geographies. So this racial pattern of the exercise of emergency authority has been legally challenged. The pattern of asset stripping and the racialized construction and management of debt functions at the international level as well. Along the North-South divide, as Jubilee and other projects have pointed out, the creation and management and collection of debt has hobbled and constrained the development of the global South. These national debts are also securitized and packaged for resale, and hence we have the vulture funds, and they have been lurking around Puerto Rico right now. Right? They want their payment. Sir Hilary Beckles recently called out Britain, this was a couple of years ago, where somebody in the Treasury Department thought it was a good idea to put on the website, you all know this story, that congratulations, British taxpayers have finally paid off the slavery debt. That is the compensation which was mandated by statute to former slaveholders at the abolition of slavery. So at the time of the abolition of slavery, the British government used 40% of its national budget to compensate slave owners as part of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. And in 2015 was when British taxpayers finally got done paying the debt. A repayment plan had to be established after the funds were borrowed to reimburse those who enriched themselves, their families, businesses, and estates from the slave trade. Okay? And these included some of the ancestors of David Cameron, who had just been chastising people, or chastising Caribbean nations for demanding reparations. The ironies are just, what can I say? The highly racialized nature of the creation, management, and collection of debt under a colorblind apparatus raises questions about the ideological infrastructure as well, and all of this occurs at a particularly fraught moment where, given our current political paroxysms, one can ask whether we are at the end of American exceptionalism. American identity, of course, promoted an exceptionalist narrative in which it cast itself as, quote, a nation of immigrants, which is an imaginary that not only obscures the nation's settler colonial origins, but served the function of being coherent with an idea of global markets and transnational population and capital flows. So in this construction, the dominant racial project was colorblindness. This is why it coheres quite nicely with neoliberalism. This is not to be confused with, of course, colorblindness with actually existing racial hierarchy, right? We're talking about this at the ideological level. The crisis of the neoliberal dispensation of the last decade saw the near failure of the global economic order, deepening inequality, and combined with advanced forms of predatory capitalism. And the Great Recession of 2008 exposed the process of asset stripping. The financialization and securitization of debt was not new to the period. This has always been a feature, right? But the absence of regulation and the erosion of the Keynesian compromise, it had run off the rails, leaving global wreckage. This was an economic crisis, surely, but a crisis of political economy and ideology as well, as the terms of democratic self-rule seemed impotent and complicit in converting a privately generated debt crisis into a public obligation. I think we forget what actually happened at the end of 2008. They put all that debt on us. Right? Against this backdrop, colorblindness, which is designed to flatten out and obscure the significance of race, as a means of protecting the existing distribution of power and resources kind of seemed inadequate to the task. The growing visibility of non-whites, particularly in the political sphere, was treated as acquisition of political power over beleaguered whites. White identity, which was mostly marked through a denial of itself through the early periods of colorblindness, had to emerge because the latent white identity lurking in the doctrinal regime of colorblindness was insufficient. It was rejected in favor of the assertion of an explicitly white national identity and a project of white redemption. In this new period, class functioned simultaneously to erase the legibility of racial inequality. So to the extent that one tries to articulate racial inequality, people say, oh, no, that's just class inequality. At the same time, class functions as a marker of race, that is white. So when we talk about the working class, we don't even need to say white. That's just implicit. In the trajectory from colorblindness to white nationalism, which is where we are, whites experience their plight not as a consequence of their class position, but as a result of their race. Their racial identity as whites then is central to the narrative of their oppression. And Trump, of course, was the master of promoting this narrative. I like to think of it as Trumpism, though, because the roots of these ideas preceded him. So Trumpism may critique globalization as a feature and strategy of neoliberalism's relentless pursuit of profit and sacrifice of domestic interests, but it's also clear that Trump's racial project connects to global racial formations. The alt-right has mobilized white victimhood through a language of national reclamation and rescue from the invasion of the dark hordes and from the internal threat of a fifth column. This alleged threat has been brought about by neoliberalism's economic agenda, which has taken from the national, parenthesis white, working classes to feed global elites in China, a kind of reverse Robin Hood in which the poor subsidize the rich. So we see, Brexit, the National Front, all of them portray themselves and their parties as the protection of the Volk from the predations of cosmopolitan and traitorous global elites who have been willing to sacrifice true national interests. Making America great again is then contiguous with making Britain great again, making France great again, making Russia great again. These are all hyper-nationalist xenophobic projects that repackage white supremacy through tropes of cultural pride and white victimhood. France has been a great teacher in this. Their aggressive commitment to colorblindness is not antithetical to, but enabling of, the turn to white nationalism. Thus, as Aaron Kundani argues, France of the 1980s has been a particularly productive location for right resurgence in Europe, and he maps in his article The Rise of the National Front as it shifted from neo-national symbolism, old guys running around in SS uniforms, to anointing itself as the front line in protecting the national identity and culture of France from invasive forces of immigration, creating an internal other that threatens the national identity. Universalism and the language of French citizenship is used to chastise racialized others whose cultural practices and rituals are deemed a willful refusal of French national identity, while at the same time state policies and practices construct communities of racialized others who remain internally exiled and physically, socially, and economically segregated. Kundani points out, since the 1990s, and particularly in the shadow of the War on Terror, far-right movements across Western Europe have learned from the National Front. They have understood how the seemingly non-racist language of culture and ethnicity can be used to engage the mythological power of white victimhood. And they understand that a different rhetorical relationship to Jewishness enables a plausible defense against accusations of neo-Nazism. Since the end of the World War II, Europe has tended to equate racism with Nazism and Nazism with anti-Semitism. Thus, mainstream acceptability for the far right is aided by publicly substituting Islamophobia for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and describing Israel, traditionally hated by post-war fascist movements, as a frontline state in the West War on Islam. And he names the parties that have followed this path, giving rise to the seeming paradox of far-right Zionists with Nazi pasts, right, and a barely submerged anti-Semitism. Right? This is apparent in Trump's affiliation with Steve Bannon. I think he sort of really represents that view. And in the interest of time, I won't go into all of the particulars, but I'll just say that White nationalists and the alt-right explicitly repudiate the old forms of white supremacy in shedding the sheets and donning suits, a la the KKK of the 1920s. It's not your father's Oldsmobile. The agenda is not about hatred, it's about sticking up for one's own. And so Bannon can thus simultaneously advance an explicitly racist nativist agenda and embrace the notion of the alt-right while denouncing neo-Nazis as backward clowns. According to a 60 Minutes interview with Charlie Rose, the neo-Nazis and the KKK are, quote, absolutely awful, and there's no room in American politics for that. He also denounced Hillary Clinton as not very bright. He said, she doesn't really have a grasp on what's important, and that's essential in a leader. Trump has a grasp on what's important. That speech of hers, referring to her denunciation of Trump's reliance on and solicitude of racism, is an embarrassment. It landed flat. Not only is it morally wrong, it's totally irrelevant. Economic nationalism is what this country was built on. The only question, the people around Schumer and Sherrod Brown get this. They understand it. They're trying to reverse it. They're trying to get the identity politics out. The only question before us, is it going to be left-wing populism or right-wing populism? So the point of this is to underscore the degree to which this move, this sort of reclamation of white nationalism, how it relates to and is affiliated with these broader dimensions of capital and the economy that I'm trying to track here. And in doing so, we have to remember that whiteness is both a bottom-up and a top-down racial construction. In an era of declining opportunity for the entire working class, white racial panic and anxiety calls for a return to a familiar form of racial populism in which the critique of economic elites and domination is articulated through white identity. And I mentioned the KKK of the 1920s because the emergence of the alt-right as a global formation tracks historical patterns in which white supremacy enters the mainstream through the commitment to protect the middle class and the working class. Right? I just want to close by saying that part of this project is to just try to lift up the idea that a lot of times I think we think about slavery as an economic system that has sort of continuing effects. I think that Cortez was trying to actually cause us to think about this in a different way. It actually is not just a sort of historical matter. It is a present matter in terms of the infrastructure of both ideas and material forms of domination. And in that regard, I want to close with what she says we should do once again. If we don't fight, if we don't resist, if we don't organize and unify and get the power to control our own lives, then we will wear the exaggerated look of captivity. And there it is. Thank you. Am I supposed to stand up here?
Are you willing to take a couple questions?
Sure.
Okay, we could probably do that until 25 after, and then we need to move the next panel up. So, does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Cheryl. That was awesome. And I really appreciated your examination of settler colonialism alongside slavery as these connected institutions which created modern America. And I guess I'm wondering if you can jettison that historical concern to the present as well. In that, one of the challenges I have frequently from my students who are absolutely right is that critical race theory and contemporary racial discourse in the U.S. still tends to give primacy to this black-white dichotomy and doesn't consider indigenous people. So how might, I guess, indigenous people and the continuing presence of settler colonialism and the continuing violent dispossession of indigenous lands, like how does that factor into, I think, your musings about, or or your analysis of neoliberalism and the material forces of domination that exist today?
It's a really important question, and I think it has been under-excavated. There's a way in which, and under-theorized, there's a way in which work regarding indigenous peoples actually participates in their erasure in a strange kind of way, in the sense that all of that is relegated to some faraway past. So some of the important work that's being done now on the relationship between slavery and capitalism, some of the economic circuitry that I was trying to sort of give voice to, actually also has its deep origins in settler colonialism, and some of the emerging work that I have seen is actually starting to fill in that gap. So, I talked about how capital structures were built on a system of slavery, but it turns out actual forms of indebtedness, financial repayment, and the like were also born out of indigenous dispossession. And in fact, I mentioned Kesu Park. Kesu has a really great piece on mortgages. And it turns out that mortgages used to be, in the old form, you could, the creditor could not collect the land. Could collect the debt, could collect other assets, but the land itself could not be taken. This innovation, which the propertization of land itself, the conversion of land into a substitution for monetary value, actually occurs in the New World. And it occurs on the back of indigenous dispossession. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of work that we need to do in order to understand the way that system has imprint right now, right? It's not just that they took the land then and we're standing on indigenous land, which we are, right? But beyond that, it's the question of how it shapes economic relations right now. Yeah. And I guess I would just say my sense is that's one of the next, I hope, arenas in which we can actually see some really important work being done. I was focusing on the transatlantic trade, but we could shift it a little bit, and then we'd be talking about Indian slavery, right? What Resendez calls the other slavery.
I think I have a question.
Okay.
In the interest of transparency, I live in Cincinnati in a neighborhood, and there are 3 check cashing places within 2 miles of my house.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what I'm thinking, I believe everything you're saying. Are there differences in these sociological markers between what you would call black neighborhoods and poor white neighborhoods?
That's a very important question, and I actually have been trying to work this out, because one of the things that I want to stress is that these predations are not unique to black communities. They tend to have a particularly virulent form and concentration.
Right.
And race enters into the whole question of the calculation of risk and the ability to assemble assets. So all of that then factors itself into who is credit worthy and who needs a payday loan. But, that's the thing about capitalism, it doesn't really discriminate. And in that sense, it discriminate in the sense of sort of utilizing its, or seeking out places and arenas where it can extract value. So yes, they are very much a feature of, I think, low-income communities in a lot of places. What I was simply trying to identify is how race factors, or how white supremacy, I guess more specifically, factors into the question of who is credit worthy, what is the risk, who has assets, and who is going to be most in need. So if you take the combination of economic vulnerability that is shaped through race, and then ask who are the populations that are most likely going to be targeted by these kinds of predatory practices. It's a reason why black communities are favored. Favored is probably the wrong word in this context, but you know what I mean. They are targeted, right? And why the subprime mortgage crisis, which had a very broad sweep, still had a very strong racial effect and concentration.
Just one more comment then about it. I see that that's one of the excuses or reasons or whatever that even in poor neighborhoods, white people feel superior.
Mm-hmm.
And they feel that people in black neighborhoods or their neighbors who are black are getting more of their fair share of resources. And I don't know
Yeah,
how that changes. But
yeah, and I think what I was trying to get at is Theodore Allen is trying to tell us why that is.
Right.
That is that the actual creation of the white race was tied to a project of creating a buffer class. And the buffer class itself, securing its position is dependent upon an antagonistic relationship with formerly enslaved, or with enslaved or formerly enslaved people. They were worried, Allen argues, about rebellion. They were worried about a cross-racial kind of coalition. And so in other parts of the global world, they solved it differently with the mulatto class, right? But here, they used poor whites, the trash that had been thrown away from Europe. Yeah?
Yes, I'm wondering if you can tease out a little bit about, you were mentioning the assumed working class as white working class. And of course, I was thinking about the United Farm Workers Movement in California, Cesar Chavez and all the other people around that time. And then today, if we fast forward, the Industrial Areas Foundation, Saul Alinsky, Ernesto Cortez, and all the trying to get a broader coalition of working class. But yeah, if you could just maybe tease out more what you were trying to say about the working class.
Yeah,
Because then I'm sorry, then I'm thinking about just a couple of months before the election, we have Bernie Sanders, who is addressing a lot of these issues, the critique of capitalism, living wage campaign. So I'm thinking that there was this huge momentum actually on the left, before Trump gets elected. And then Trump gets elected, and then we're all like flat. And that whole discourse somehow dies out.
Right. Well, so there's a lot in your question. I'll start a little bit quickly historically because I know we're running short of time. But I think I would just draw on David Roediger's classic, The Wages of Whiteness, which explains how white working class identity is constructed in opposition to slavery. So the working class articulates itself right from the beginning as we're not slaves. We don't want to be like slaves, we don't want to be treated like slaves, and because slavery is a racially encoded category, that then in turn shapes working class identity as white. So, in the United States, one can say, I'm going to a working class neighborhood, you don't have to say white. And this is so, even notwithstanding what you accurately point out, which is the working class has never been white, all white. It's always been a multiracial formation, but ideologically it is presented in a different form. So when they say, we're worried about, now we've sort of entered a period where white is explicitly being named, right? And that's sort of the interesting part of what I was trying to track with this global sort of resurgence of articulation of white supremacy. Why is this a felt need at this point? Why doesn't colorblindness do enough work? Why is there a need now to put white identity front and center in this way? And then in terms of the second part, which is the contemporary question, tell me again, I'm sorry.
Sorry, just how everything that I think the Sanders campaign stood for has been crushed and wiped out, it seems, of the discourse,
Well, I think in part, I'll just say that had I had an opportunity, I would have voted for Sanders for president. So, however, I will say that some of the difficulties with addressing the kind of dimensions of race and class and its intersections were really problematic in his campaign as well. And what I mean by that is to say that you can sort of see it now in terms of the diagnosis, the sort of autopsy of the 2016 presidential election, in which we now have a lot of wise, parenthesis white, men, and some women, suggesting to us that the loss was due to the failure to place white working class concerns and identity up front, and a kind of obsession with identity politics. So we're getting this kind of analysis that suggests that the problem, or that the result of the 2016 campaign was a product of too much of a focus on race. And so I think that's why when you describe it as flat, what is the point of intervention that a left or progressive force might have if you accept that narrative? There's nowhere you can go because Trump already has that ground. Right. So I think in part that's what we sort of are finding, and this is why I'm trying to return to what are the ways in which we can try to understand a description about our contemporary racial reality that connects, because it connects not only to racially subordinated groups, but to working class whites as well. I mean, one of the things that Allen argues is that this deal that gets cut actually has some benefits for the white working class, but ultimately sutures them into a coalition with the people that are oppressing them. This can't be good. And I think if you look at the actual conditions right now, you see why. You know, opioid crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can keep going, right? And yet they remain sort of loyal to the project, even as the sort of shredded nature, the little shreds that are left of the Social Security, social welfare state are being dismantled, right? So.
We are going to have to take any
Yes.
more questions at the wine reception at the end.
Wine reception, yes.